Charles Bukowski was not your typical poet. His work didn't shimmer with idealism or offer escapist fantasies. Instead, it struck like a gut punch, raw and unapologetically real. In a world obsessed with appearances and relentless ambition, Bukowski stood apart, embodying the grit and chaos of ordinary existence. And then there's his infamous mantra, "Don't try." At first glance, it seems paradoxical. How can one not try in a world that demands effort? Was this phrase a sly nod to nihilism, or did it conceal a profound truth about how to approach life and creation? Think about it. We're conditioned to believe that success is a product of hard work and endless striving. Yet, Bukowski's philosophy defies this. He wasn't suggesting that we sit idle or give up. Instead, he was pointing toward something more nuanced, a life lived authentically, where effort flows naturally rather than being forced. It's a message that seems almost radical today, in an era that glorifies the grind. What makes Bukowski's life so fascinating is how much of it he spent on the fringes. Born in 1920 in Andernach, Germany, Bukowski emigrated to the United States as a child. His upbringing in Los Angeles was far from the glamorous Hollywood dream. Raised by an abusive father, he endured years of physical and emotional torment. Add to that his severe acne, which left both physical and psychological scars, and you can see why Bukowski turned to the written word as a form of escape and rebellion. It's tempting to frame Bukowski's story as one of overcoming adversity, but he never saw himself as a conqueror of his pain. Instead, he lived fully in it. This perspective aligns closely with Gabriel Marcel's existential philosophy, particularly as explored in The Mystery of Being. Marcel suggests that suffering isn't something to solve, but rather a reality to engage with deeply. For Bukowski, pain was not an obstacle but a teacher, shaping his voice and his worldview. He didn't seek to transcend it, he chose to embrace it. So, when Bukowski said, "Don't try," he was stripping away the societal pressure to perform, to conform, to be someone you're not. He wasn't advocating laziness, he was rejecting the idea of trying for the sake of appearances. His life invites us to consider a crucial question. What would happen if we stopped chasing approval and allowed our true selves to emerge? The world Bukowski inhabited was far from perfect. It was messy, loud, and unforgiving. But it was in this chaos that he found his voice. And through that voice, he invites us to explore the messiness of our own lives, not as something to fix, but as something to feel. Could it be that Bukowski's "don't try" philosophy holds a key to a more authentic existence? Keep watching as we unravel the layers of his life and thought, revealing how his simple yet powerful approach might just change the way we see ourselves and the world. Bukowski's roots: authenticity born from pain. To understand Bukowski's philosophy, you have to trace it back to his roots. Born Heinrich Karl Bukowski in Andernach, Germany, in 1920, his life was marked by hardship from the very beginning. His family moved to Los Angeles when he was still a child, seeking the promise of the American dream. But instead of opportunity, young Bukowski found isolation and cruelty. His father, a former US serviceman, was abusive, unleashing his frustrations on Charles with a strictness that bordered on sadistic. Bukowski often spoke about the beatings he endured, the kind that left more than physical scars. Add to this a severe case of acne during his teenage years, leaving his face pocked with scars and his confidence shattered. Social rejection became a constant companion. By all accounts, Bukowski's early years were defined by a sense of alienation and invisibility. But here's the fascinating part. Instead of breaking him, this alienation became the wellspring of his authenticity. Bukowski's struggles echo the ideas of phenomenologist Gabriel Marcel, particularly his thoughts in The Mystery of Being. Marcel argued that suffering is not just an affliction, but also a means of uncovering the deeper layers of existence. For Bukowski, life's rawness wasn't something to escape, but to explore. It wasn't about romanticizing pain, but about accepting it as an inseparable part of being human. Imagine the countless people who live through hardship, struggling to find meaning. Bukowski, through his work, became a voice for those people. He didn't write about heroes or grand adventures. He wrote about ordinary lives, broken, messy, and unremarkable on the surface. Yet he managed to make them profound. This is where his authenticity came through. Take a moment to consider this. Bukowski didn't filter his experiences to fit societal norms or literary expectations. He didn't chase polished prose or lofty ideals. Instead, he allowed his pain, his flaws, and his vulnerabilities to flow into his writing unaltered. He turned the mundane and the ugly into something brutally honest and strangely beautiful. By the time Bukowski began his journey as a writer, he had lived through a great deal: abuse, loneliness, and countless odd jobs that kept him barely afloat. These experiences were his canvas. They gave him a perspective that no privileged or insulated life could offer. It was this raw authenticity that resonated with readers, making them feel seen and understood in ways no polished self-help book ever could. His early life forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that authenticity often comes at a price. Bukowski's scars, both visible and invisible, were the very things that made his voice unique. And yet, they also remind us that suffering isn't just a curse. It can also be a kind of teacher. So, when Bukowski wrote about failure, rejection, and loneliness, it wasn't theoretical. It was real. His struggles weren't dressed up as moral victories or turned into tidy lessons. They were presented as they were, raw and unvarnished. This is where Bukowski's genius lay. He didn't just tell you about life. He showed you its scars and dared you to look at your own. Don't try, and the effortless flow of true creation. At the heart of Bukowski's philosophy lies his most quoted mantra: don't try. On the surface, it seems to contradict everything we've been taught. Isn't trying the cornerstone of success? Isn't effort what separates winners from losers? But Bukowski wasn't advocating laziness or defeatism. His message wasn't about doing nothing. It was about doing everything with authenticity and flow. Imagine this. You sit down to create something, a poem, a painting, or even a business plan. If you're forcing it, pushing yourself to make it perfect, it rarely works. The words feel hollow, the strokes lack life, and the results fall flat. Bukowski understood this intuitively. Don't try wasn't a rejection of effort. It was a call to stop forcing outcomes. This philosophy aligns beautifully with the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or effortless action. Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, described this as the art of aligning with the natural flow of life rather than fighting against it. Imagine a river. When you swim with its current, progress feels smooth and natural. When you fight against it, every stroke is a struggle. Bukowski lived his life like the river. His creativity wasn't something he strained to produce. It flowed through him when he surrendered to it. Bukowski's writing process reflected this. He didn't sit at his typewriter and try to craft perfect prose. He wrote about what he knew: bars, broken relationships, the drudgery of low-paying jobs, without worrying about how it would be received. This lack of pretense is what made his work resonate so deeply. readers felt they weren't being sold an idea or manipulated into an emotional response. Instead, they were being shown life as it was, unapologetically raw and real. In one of his letters, Bukowski explained what "don't try" meant to him. It wasn't about inaction, but about authenticity. It meant not straining to be something you're not. When creation comes from a place of honesty, it doesn't need to be forced. It just is. This is a powerful message in a world where we're constantly pressured to perform, to compete, and to prove our worth. But "don't try" doesn't mean giving up on dreams or abandoning effort altogether. Bukowski worked tirelessly as a writer, churning out poems, short stories, and novels despite decades of rejection. The difference was that he didn't try to write like anyone else or fit into literary conventions. He simply wrote as himself, and that authenticity eventually found its audience. This idea challenges us to rethink how we approach not just creativity, but life itself. Are we striving for things that don't align with who we are? Are we forcing ourselves into roles that don't feel natural? Bukowski's mantra is an invitation to pause and consider whether our effort is genuine or performative. By embracing the flow of life and letting go of the need to control everything, Bukowski created works that felt alive, brimming with truth and vulnerability. In doing so, he showed us that sometimes the best way to create is not to try, but to simply be. Turning pain into resilience, the alchemy of life. Charles Bukowski's life was anything but easy. From the physical abuse he endured as a child to the decades of rejection he faced as a writer, his existence was a masterclass in hardship. And yet he didn't crumble under the weight of it. Instead, he turned his pain into art, transforming his struggles into something meaningful. This process wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, almost alchemical. Alchemy, the ancient mystical practice, sought to turn base metals into gold. While this was often seen as a literal pursuit, its deeper symbolic meaning was about transformation, taking the dross of life and refining it into something extraordinary. Bukowski embodied this principle in his work. His pain, his loneliness, his failures, they were the base metals of his life. Through his writing, he transmuted them into poetry and prose that resonated with millions. One lesser-known text, the Book of Lambspring, explores this idea of internal transformation. It speaks of a process where the dark matter of human experience, pain, sorrow, and imperfection, is not something to be discarded, but something to be worked with, refined, and elevated. Bukowski's life mirrored this idea perfectly. He didn't deny or suppress his suffering. He embraced it as the raw material for his art. Take his poetry, for example. In one of his most famous lines, Bukowski writes, "What matters most is how well you walk through the fire." This isn't a call to extinguish the fire or avoid it altogether. It's about enduring it, allowing it to burn away pretense and leave behind something raw and real. For Bukowski, the fire was life itself. The pain of rejection, the monotony of factory jobs, the heartbreak of failed relationships. Each of these experiences became fuel for his creativity. Bukowski's approach also reminds us of the Buddhist concept of dukkha, or suffering, which is seen as an inherent part of life. In Buddhist philosophy, the goal isn't to eliminate suffering, but to understand and transform our relationship with it. Bukowski intuitively grasped this idea. His writing didn't offer escapism or solutions. It offered solidarity. He showed readers that suffering wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a shared human experience that could be turned into something meaningful. But it wasn't just about enduring pain. It was about resilience. Bukowski was rejected by publishers for decades. His work was deemed too crude, too raw, too unpolished. Yet he persisted, continuing to write even when no one was reading. This resilience wasn't born out of blind optimism, but out of a stubborn refusal to let others define his worth. There's a lesson here for all of us. Life will hand us our share of difficulties, heartbreak, failure, rejection. The question is, what will we do with it? Will we let it weigh us down, or will we use it as material to create something meaningful? Bukowski's life is proof that even the ugliest experiences can be transformed into something beautiful if we're willing to face them head-on. His process challenges us to reframe our own struggles. Instead of viewing them as obstacles, can we see them as opportunities for growth, as raw materials for our own creative or personal transformation? Bukowski's alchemy reminds us that pain, though difficult, can be a powerful teacher and even a source of profound beauty. The role of rejection in Bukowski's life, an existential perspective. Rejection was a recurring theme in Bukowski's life. He spent decades submitting his work to publishers, only to be met with silence or outright dismissal. His writing, often unfiltered and unapologetically raw, didn't fit neatly into the literary conventions of the time. Yet it was precisely this rejection that shaped Bukowski into the writer he became. A man whose art thrived not in spite of rejection, but because of it. In existential philosophy, rejection can be seen as a moment of confrontation with the absurdity of life. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his philosophy of existentialism, posited that humans exist in a world without inherent meaning, and it is up to each individual to create their own essence through their actions. Bukowski embodied this concept. He didn't wait for the world to validate his voice. He wrote and lived on his own terms, crafting meaning from his experiences. Think about the modern fear of rejection. We hesitate to apply for jobs, share our art, or pursue unconventional paths because of the potential for failure. Bukowski faced this fear head-on, receiving rejection slip after rejection slip, but never stopping. His persistence reminds us that rejection isn't the end of the road. It's part of the process of finding and affirming one's essence. A striking parallel can be found in Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet. Thacker explores the concept of hopelessness in an indifferent universe, suggesting that confronting the void can lead to a deeper understanding of existence. Bukowski's years of rejection were his confrontation with the void. He saw the literary establishment's indifference not as a sign to stop, but as a challenge to keep creating. In doing so, he found a way to turn that rejection into resilience. This resilience is what makes Bukowski's story so compelling. For years he lived in near poverty, working menial jobs that barely paid the bills. He drank heavily, gambled, and often teetered on the edge of self-destruction. But even in his darkest moments, he wrote, writing was his anchor, his way of asserting his existence in a world that often seemed intent on erasing him. In one of his letters, Bukowski wrote, "The problem was you had to keep choosing between one evil or another, and no matter what you chose, they sliced a little bit more off you until there was nothing left. At least I kept writing. That was something." It's a powerful reminder that when the world rejects us, we can still choose to create, to persist, to be. Bukowski didn't write for fame or recognition. Those things came much later, and almost incidentally. He wrote because he had to, because it was the only way he knew to make sense of his existence. This existential act of creating meaning through writing is something we can all learn from, whether it's art, relationships, or simply how we navigate our lives. Rejection doesn't have to define us. Instead, it can refine us, forcing us to strip away the superficial and focus on what truly matters. Bukowski's story challenges us to ask, how can we transform rejection into resilience? How can we use life's no as fuel for our own yes? Bukowski and the philosophy of being versus trying. Bukowski's disdain for the act of trying wasn't just a personal quirk. It was a profound philosophical stance. His mantra, "Don't try," was a call to embrace being over striving, authenticity over pretense. This philosophy stands in sharp contrast to a culture that equates effort with worth, urging us to grind harder, reach higher, and constantly perform. Bukowski's message asks us to consider, what happens when we simply allow ourselves to be? This idea has deep roots in Zen Buddhism. Dogen, one of Zen's most influential teachers, wrote in the Shobogenzo about the importance of living fully in the present moment without attachment to outcomes. Dogen's teaching wasn't about abandoning effort, but about shifting the focus. Instead of striving toward a goal, the practice was to engage in each moment completely, letting the results take care of themselves. For Bukowski, writing was his way of practicing this philosophy. He didn't write to impress publishers or chase fame. He wrote because it was what he was. The act of writing flowed from his core, unburdened by the need for validation. His words were raw, unfiltered, and often messy, but they were undeniably his. In this sense, Bukowski embodied the Zen idea of just being. He was a writer not because he tried to be one, but because he simply was one. Let's contrast this with the modern obsession with self-improvement. We're bombarded with messages to do more, achieve more, and constantly upgrade ourselves. But this endless striving often leaves us feeling empty, as if we're chasing a moving target. Bukowski rejected this paradigm entirely. For him, the art of living wasn't about achieving perfection, but about embracing imperfection. This approach resonates with the Buddhist idea of non-attachment. When we let go of the need to control outcomes, we create space for authenticity. Bukowski's writing thrived in this space. He didn't concern himself with what the literary establishment thought of him. He didn't polish his words to fit a particular mold. Instead, he allowed his truth to flow onto the page, unencumbered by the need to try. In one of his most famous poems, Roll the Dice, Bukowski wrote, "If you're going to try, go all the way. Otherwise, don't even start." At first glance, this seems to contradict his mantra of "don't try." But the deeper meaning becomes clear when you consider it through the lens of authenticity. Bukowski wasn't advocating half-hearted effort. He was urging us to commit fully to what we truly are, not to what we think we should be. This tension between trying and being is something we all face. How often do we act out of a sense of obligation or fear of judgment, rather than from a place of genuine passion? Bukowski's philosophy invites us to step back and ask, are we trying to live, or are we simply living? Bukowski's life was far from perfect, but it was honest. He wasn't afraid to show his flaws, his failures, or his pain. In doing so, he reminded us that there's a certain grace in imperfection, a beauty in simply being who we are. The challenge for us is to let go of the need to try to be someone else and to embrace the person we already are. The grit and beauty of the mundane. Aesthetic philosophy. Bukowski had a way of elevating the ordinary into something extraordinary. He wrote about the dingy corners of life, the worn-out bar stools, the cigarette-strewn motel rooms, the endless grind of dead-end jobs. On the surface, these aren't the ingredients of high art. Yet, Bukowski found beauty in them, turning life's mundane realities into poetry that resonated deeply. How did he manage to make the ordinary feel so profound? To answer that, Let's turn to the aesthetic philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, particularly his work, The World as Will and Representation. Schopenhauer argued that art has the power to transcend the pain and monotony of everyday existence. By capturing moments of life in their rawest form, art allows us to see the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. For Bukowski, this wasn't a theoretical exercise, it was his entire approach to writing. Take his poem The Shoelace, where he lists the small frustrations of life: a broken shoelace, a lost key, a spilled cup of coffee. These are the kind of moments we shrug off, barely noticing their weight. But Bukowski saw them as profound. He wrote, "It's not the large things that send a man to the madhouse, death he's ready for, or murder, incest, robbery, fire, flood. No, it's the continuing series of small tragedies that send a man to the madhouse." Here, Bukowski invites us to pause and really look at the small details of life. He reminds us that the mundane isn't meaningless, it's where life happens. This ability to find poetry in the everyday is what made his work so relatable. He didn't write about grandiose themes or distant ideals. He wrote about the lives most of us live, messy, repetitive, and imperfect, yet full of quiet moments of truth. Bukowski's view also parallels Buddhist teachings about mindfulness. Buddhism encourages us to be present, to fully engage with the here and now, no matter how ordinary it seems. Washing dishes, drinking tea, or walking down the street, all these acts can become meditative when approached with full awareness. Bukowski's writing achieves a similar effect. By focusing on the grit of life, he forces us to confront it, to sit with it, and to find meaning in it. But Bukowski didn't just observe the mundane, he embraced it. He saw beauty in the cracks and flaws, in the struggles and imperfections. This perspective is deeply liberating, especially in a world that often feels obsessed with perfection and glamour. Bukowski's work is a reminder that there's value in the unpolished and the overlooked. His stories and poems are peppered with images of greasy diners, cheap booze, and crumbling apartments. Yet, these aren't backdrops for despair. They're celebrations of resilience. Bukowski's characters may be down on their luck, but they're alive, fighting, feeling. In this way, he turns the mundane into a canvas for human experience, reminding us that even life's smallest moments hold the potential for beauty and truth. So the next time you're stuck in traffic, standing in line, or staring at the peeling paint on a wall, consider this. What would Bukowski see in this moment? How might he capture its essence, not as something to escape, but as something to embrace? His work challenges us to find the extraordinary within the ordinary, to recognize that life's true poetry lies not in perfection, but in its flaws. Love beyond romance, Sufism, and unconditional devotion. When people think of Charles Bukowski, the first thing that comes to mind might not be love. After all, his writing often depicted the messy, chaotic, and even destructive sides of human relationships. But to dismiss him as merely cynical would be to miss one of the most profound aspects of his philosophy: his unwavering devotion to his art and his life, lived entirely on his own terms. For Bukowski, love wasn't just a feeling between two people. It was a force, a commitment, and a way of being. Bukowski's concept of love transcended the romantic. In his poetry, he often spoke of writing as a lover, temperamental, demanding, yet utterly vital. His devotion to his craft echoes the teachings of Sufism, particularly the idea of surrendering oneself completely to a beloved, whether that beloved is a person, a passion, or the divine. Sufism, a mystical branch of Islam, views love as a path to union with the divine, achieved through selflessness and total commitment. Consider The Conference of the Birds by Attar of Nishapur, a classic Sufi text. In this allegorical tale, a group of birds sets out to find their king, the simurgh, only to discover that the journey itself transforms them. Along the way, they must abandon their egos, desires, and fears. For Bukowski, writing was this kind of journey. It wasn't about reaching a destination like fame or wealth. It was about the act itself, a continual process of giving himself over to the page, no matter the cost. In his poem, Bluebird, Bukowski reveals a softer, hidden side of himself. "There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him, I say. Stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you." This bluebird represents vulnerability, tenderness, and perhaps even love in its purest form. Bukowski's choice to keep it hidden reflects his understanding of love as something fragile yet powerful, something that must be protected even in a harsh world. What's striking is how Bukowski's life mirrored this philosophy. He wasn't afraid to love the unlovable, life itself in all its grit and grime. He loved the act of writing, even when it brought rejection or ridicule. And perhaps most importantly, he loved the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or ugly it appeared. In this way, Bukowski's life and work resonate with the Sufi idea of unconditional devotion. Just as the Sufi poets wrote about surrendering to the divine, Bukowski surrendered to his art. He gave himself fully, without asking for anything in return. This kind of love is rare and transformative, a reminder that true devotion doesn't seek rewards or recognition. It simply is. What can we take from this? Bukowski's example challenges us to ask, what do we truly love? And are we willing to give ourselves to it completely without guarantees or conditions? Whether it's a person, a passion, or even life itself, Bukowski's philosophy reminds us that love, in its most profound form, is about showing up fully, flaws and all. The bluebird in Bukowski's heart, mysticism and hidden truth. Bukowski's poem Bluebird remains one of his most hauntingly beautiful works. In it, he confesses to keeping a part of himself, the vulnerable, tender part, hidden away. The poem reads almost like a prayer, an intimate moment where Bukowski allows us to glimpse the quiet truths he usually kept locked beneath his hardened exterior. "There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him, I say. Stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you." The bluebird, in this case, represents more than just vulnerability. It symbolizes a hidden truth, a spiritual core that Bukowski shielded from the world. This theme resonates deeply with the Christian mystical tradition, particularly the teachings of the cloud of unknowing. This 14th century text speaks of the divine as something hidden within us, something we can only approach by embracing humility and letting go of our ego-driven desires. Bukowski's Bluebird reflects this hidden, divine essence. Despite his reputation as a hard-drinking, foul-mouthed cynic, his work reveals a man deeply attuned to the fragility and beauty of the human condition. He wasn't afraid to acknowledge the darkness of life, but he also recognized the light that exists within it, however faint or fleeting. In mysticism, the act of hiding or guarding something precious is often a form of protection. The bluebird isn't locked away out of fear, but out of necessity. Bukowski knew that exposing his softer side in a world as harsh as his own could leave him vulnerable to being crushed. And yet, the mere act of writing about the bluebird was an offering, a way of sharing that hidden truth without completely surrendering it. This duality, toughness on the outside, tenderness within, is something we all grapple with to some degree. How often do we hide parts of ourselves out of fear that the world won't understand or accept them? Bukowski's poem invites us to consider the cost of such concealment, and whether, like him, we might find ways to let those hidden truths emerge in our own time. The bluebird also connects to the idea of universal humanity. It's a reminder that beneath our masks and defenses, we all carry something fragile and beautiful. Bukowski's willingness to admit this, even in the smallest way, is a profound act of courage. It's an acknowledgement that toughness doesn't mean the absence of vulnerability. It means carrying that vulnerability with grace and strength. What's more, the bluebird speaks to the transformative power of art. For Bukowski, writing was a way to give voice to the parts of himself he couldn't otherwise express. The act of creation allowed him to release the bluebird, if only for a moment, and share it with the world. Bukowski's life and work remind us of a timeless truth, that within each of us lies a hidden spark, a quiet bluebird waiting to be acknowledged. It's not about bearing it to everyone, but about finding a way to honor it in our own lives. What would happen if we allowed ourselves to listen to that small, soft voice within? Could it guide us to something more authentic, more profound? Bukowski, as a modern-day shaman, the power of words for healing. Charles Bukowski's work, while often gritty and unfiltered, had an undeniable healing quality for those who resonated with it. His words spoke to the pain, disillusionment, and quiet despair that many people experience but rarely articulate. In this sense, Bukowski was more than a poet or a novelist. He was a modern-day shaman, using storytelling to guide others through their struggles and connect with something larger than themselves. Shamans, in traditional cultures, are healers who bridge the physical and spiritual worlds. They don't heal with medicine alone. They use stories, rituals, and symbols to help people navigate their inner landscapes. Bukowski did something remarkably similar with his writing. His stories weren't polished fables or moral tales. They were raw, often uncomfortable accounts of life's messiness. But in that rawness, they offered solace to those who saw themselves reflected in his words. Michael Harner's The Way of the Shaman describes the shamanic journey as one of descent and return, entering the depths of human experience and bringing back something transformative. Bukowski's life mirrored this journey. He descended into the underworld of human existence, poverty, addiction, and rejection. Yet he emerged with something powerful, words that captured the shared struggles of being human. Consider the way Bukowski wrote about failure. In his world, failure wasn't something to be avoided or feared. It was a constant, an inevitable part of life. But instead of painting it as a final defeat, he reframed it as a stepping stone, a shared experience that binds us all. His readers, often those who felt marginalized or overlooked, found in his work a validation of their own struggles. One of Bukowski's most striking qualities was his ability to hold up a mirror to society without sugarcoating the reflection. He didn't shy away from the ugliness or the chaos. Yet, in doing so, he helped others confront their own realities and perhaps even find a sense of catharsis. His poetry and prose often functioned like shamanic rituals, acts of naming and confronting pain, which is the first step in healing. For Bukowski, naming his demons through writing was a way of taking their power away. For his readers, seeing those demons named was a way of recognizing their own pain and realizing they weren't alone. One of his most poignant lines captures this shamanic essence perfectly. "You have to die a few times before you can really live." This idea speaks to the transformative power of suffering. Like the shamanic journey, it's about facing death, whether literal or metaphorical, and emerging on the other side with a deeper understanding of life. Bukowski's work reminds us that healing doesn't come from avoiding pain, but from confronting it and finding meaning within it. In a way, Bukowski's life was his own ritual. Every rejection, Every failed relationship, every hard-drinking night became material for his art. And through that art, he turned his personal pain into something universal. His readers might not have lived his exact life, but they understood his emotions: loneliness, anger, resilience, and hope. Bukowski's power lay in his ability to turn the personal into the collective, to show that even in the grimiest corners of life, there is a shared humanity. His work asks us to consider, what pain are we holding on to? How might we transform it into something that connects us to others? Bukowski's influence on modern spirituality, a call to authenticity. Charles Bukowski might not be the first name that comes to mind when you think of spirituality, yet his life and work resonate deeply with modern spiritual movements, particularly those emphasizing authenticity and self-discovery. In an age where curated perfection dominates social media and self-help books promise formulaic paths to happiness, Bukowski's raw, unfiltered voice stands out as a call to embrace life in all its messiness. At its core, modern spirituality often encourages individuals to strip away societal expectations and uncover their true selves. This aligns perfectly with Bukowski's philosophy. He rejected pretense, opting instead to live and create on his own terms. His message wasn't about achieving enlightenment through polished rituals or ascetic practices. It was about finding truth in the everyday, the mundane, and even the painful. James Redfield's The Celestine Prophecy explores the idea of spiritual awakening through personal authenticity and connection to the present moment. Bukowski's life echoes this concept, though in a grittier, more grounded form. He didn't seek transcendence in the traditional sense. Instead, he found it in the act of writing, in the simple yet profound commitment to staying true to himself. Bukowski's rejection of trying can also be seen as a spiritual practice. In a world that constantly demands effort, achievement, and perfection, his mantra, "Don't try," is a radical reminder to let go of the ego-driven need to prove oneself. This mirrors teachings from various spiritual traditions, including Buddhism, which emphasizes non-attachment, and Taoism, which champions effortless action through alignment with one's natural flow. His influence extends beyond literature, reaching into the realms of New Age thought and modern mindfulness. While many spiritual frameworks emphasize the pursuit of inner peace, Bukowski's approach reminds us that peace doesn't come from avoiding life's challenges, but from facing them head-on. He embraced the full spectrum of human experience: joy, sorrow, love, rejection, and turned it into art. Consider his legacy in the context of today's spiritual movements. Many people are seeking authenticity, tired of the hollow promises of material success and superficial happiness. Bukowski's work offers an alternative, a life lived unapologetically, where the goal isn't perfection, but presence. He invites us to be real, even when it's uncomfortable or imperfect. One of Bukowski's lesser-known lines speaks directly to this modern yearning for authenticity. "Your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dank submission." It's a call to wake up, to resist the pressures of conformity, and to live fully in one's truth. This sentiment resonates deeply with movements like mindfulness and New Age spirituality, which emphasize the importance of living consciously and authentically. Yet Bukowski's spirituality wasn't tied to doctrines or rituals. It was rooted in the act of creation, in the simple yet profound practice of turning one's experiences into art. His writing reminds us that spirituality doesn't have to be otherworldly. It can be found in the act of being fully alive, fully present, and fully ourselves. Bukowski's influence on modern spirituality lies in his ability to inspire self-acceptance. His life asks us to consider: what masks are we wearing? What parts of ourselves are we hiding to fit into societal molds? And most importantly, what would it mean to let those masks fall away and live as we truly are? Bukowski's wisdom, daring to embrace life as it is. As we come to the end of Bukowski's journey, one thing becomes clear. His life wasn't about surrendering to despair or giving up on effort. It was about embracing life as it is, with all its flaws, struggles, and fleeting moments of beauty. In a world that often demands perfection, Bukowski dared to live imperfectly, fully, and authentically. His mantra, "Don't try," was not a rejection of action, but a rejection of pretense, a call to strip away the unnecessary and focus on what truly matters. Bukowski's approach to life challenges many of our modern assumptions. We're often told that happiness lies in achieving more, being better, or striving harder. But Bukowski turned this idea on its head, suggesting that peace and creativity come not from forcing ourselves into molds, but from letting go. This perspective resonates with Alan Watts's insights in The Wisdom of Insecurity. Watts argued that true freedom comes from accepting the uncertainty of life, from surrendering our need to control and instead embracing the present moment. Bukowski's poetry and prose echo this sentiment. He didn't write about grand victories or happily ever afters. He wrote about the bar fights, the heartbreaks, the sleepless nights. Yet in these moments, he found something profoundly human, a raw, unvarnished truth that resonates because it's real. His work reminds us that life's messiness isn't something to escape, it's something to embrace. Think about his poem, "Let It Enfold You." In it, Bukowski reflects on his younger years, filled with anger and resistance, and contrasts them with his later acceptance of life's ebb and flow. There is a light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. This isn't blind optimism. It's a hard-won wisdom that acknowledges life's pain while still finding room for its small joys. Bukowski wasn't a man of grand philosophies or lofty ideals. His wisdom came from living, failing, and trying again, not in the forced sense, but in the organic way life demands. What does Bukowski's life teach us about our own? In a world obsessed with outcomes, his work invites us to focus on the process. Whether it's creating art, building relationships, or simply navigating the everyday, the act of showing up, flaws and all, is what matters. Bukowski didn't seek perfection, he sought truth. And in that truth, he found liberation. As you reflect on Bukowski's philosophy, consider this. What parts of your life are you trying to force? What would happen if you let go of those pressures and allowed yourself to simply be? Bukowski's story is a reminder that we don't need to have it all figured out. Life isn't about perfect plans or flawless execution. It's about finding meaning in the chaos, joy in the mundane, and truth in the imperfect. So, can we dare to live like Bukowski, not in his vices or his excesses, but in his authenticity? Can we embrace the unpredictable, the imperfect, and the messy with the same unflinching honesty? In the end, Bukowski's wisdom lies in his reminder that life's beauty isn't found in trying to escape its hardships, but in learning to walk through its fire with grace. Your life, as Bukowski might say, is your own. Will you let it unfold, messy and magnificent, or will you keep trying to make it something it's not? The choice, as always, is yours.